Okay.
Hello, everyone. We are pleased today to have an interview with Professor Glenn Geher. Uh, and Professor Geher, I'm going to present Professor Geher. He is currently professor of psychology at the State University of New York at New Paltz. Professor Geher has a BA in psychology at the University of Connecticut, a master's degree in psychology at the University of New Hampshire, and a PhD also in psychology, also at the University of New Hampshire. Professor Geher has been the director of the New Paltz Evolutionary Psychology Lab since 2000 and has a blog called Darwin's Subterranean World at Psychology Today. Professor Geher has published more than 4,000 academic articles and is the author of 9 books, including the one we will be discussing today, Positive Evolutionary Psychology, Darwin's Guide to Living a Richer Life, which was published in 2019 and was written with Nicole Wendeberg. So, Professor Geher, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And the first question is that's in your book, Positive Evolutionary Psychology. Your book is an attempt to apply evolutionary psychology to the field of positive psychology. Could you explain this idea and the reasons that led you to write the book?
Sure. Yeah. So I just want to thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate you thinking of me and thinking of my work. And my newest work, based on the book Positive Evolutionary Psychology, is really, as you're suggesting, Walter, an attempt to try to push evolutionary psychology or the study of evolution and human behavior in, I guess, what I'll call a more positive kind of direction. I'm fascinated, as is anyone in this group, by the evolution and human interface. And when I was an undergraduate at the University of Connecticut about 100 years ago, I remember taking a class simply titled Animal Behavior. And in full disclosure, I took it because I had a choice between that and something called physiological psychology, which sounded scary. So I took animal behavior, and what I came to find was that the entire course was taught from an evolutionary perspective, which is something that was not touched in any other of my classes. And I was immediately captivated. The professor, Benjamin Sachs, he was a rat researcher. He studied sexuality in rats, and I actually worked in his lab for a year and have some wild stories from that, to be honest. But we can leave that for another time. But in his course, he talked about evolution and evolution applied to behavior in a way that was so profound that you could use the principles of natural selection to understand such broad species as any kind of insect, any kind of fish, mammals. He talked about pecking orders in chickens from an evolutionary perspective, emotional expressions in chimpanzees from an evolutionary perspective. And I'd never had a psychology class where there was such a simple, powerful, illuminating set of basic ideas applied so broadly. And I took that course at about the same time I was applying to social psychology PhD programs. And I became really, really interested in thinking, how can we take the ideas from that animal behavior class and apply them to issues of human social psychology? So I was very fortunate to get into a PhD program at the University of New Hampshire in social psychology. And while I was there in 1994, a man named David Buss came to give a talk. David Buss is, I'm going to say, arguably the best known evolutionary psychologist worldwide, and has been for a long time. He's profoundly influential and important. He's a great guy. He's a great researcher. And he gave a talk on his book titled Evolution of Desire, which really was all about understanding human mating from an evolutionary perspective. And the way I saw it was, this is social psychology done right. And I'd never heard of anyone else doing social psychology that way, looking at an issue regarding human social behavior and thinking, how can we apply an evolutionary framework to understanding why this behavior exists? And it was quite fascinating to me. In fact, it was a game changer for me. It was like an integration of everything I'd learned from that undergraduate animal behavior class to my interest in human social behavior. So I finished my PhD. I was very fortunate a few years later to get a job at the State University of New York, which I've been at for, this is actually going on to my 25th year right now. Time goes fast. And I became very immersed in what is called evolutionary psychology, sometimes called evolutionary behavioral studies, or evolutionary behavioral science as well. But one of the things that stood out to me, and has stood out to me across my career, especially after my PhD was completed, was how much misunderstanding there is regarding evolutionary psychology, and how much hostility there is, like literal, genuine hostility toward evolutionary psychology. And when I was in my early 30s and late 20s, starting my career, I was kind of confused. I was like, don't you get it? This makes total sense. We're animals. We came about by natural selection. The human nervous system is a product of natural selection. Human behavior is a product of the nervous system. We can use Darwin's ideas to understand who we are in a profound way. One example I like to give is, it's as if there's a storm and the power's out in your house, and you go into your basement looking for a flashlight, but you can't find a flashlight because all the power's out. And imagine how much easier it would be if someone turned on a light so that you could find it. That's what evolution is like. It allows you to have this much bigger and focused framework for asking any questions about human behavior. And I've just been so fascinated by it. So the hostility that I saw launched toward evolutionary psychology, to me, it really seemed counterproductive, and still does. It seems to me like, if our goal is really to understand human behavior and its causes so that we can build a better world together, which I think in a lot of ways is the goal of academia and science and so forth, don't we want to use the most powerful framework and set of ideas regarding human life and life in general that has ever been articulated, namely Darwin's theory of natural selection? So that's kind of been, that narrative has kind of been underlying my entire career. And at some point, I became really interested in pushing towards something that I'm calling positive evolutionary psychology, which is, instead of taking evolutionary principles and applying them to the dark side of the human experience, which is totally appropriate, by the way, understanding homicide, understanding murder, understanding sexual assault, understanding negative emotional states, understanding depression. We can understand all of that better with an evolutionary framework. So I'm absolutely unequivocally not against that research. But to me, there's a PR problem, or a sort of public relations problem, whereby research on those dark topics has been so highly publicized that there's a lot of people, and a lot of very smart people, a lot of academics, a lot of people at esteemed universities, such as where some of you are working now, there's a lot of people who don't seem to realize that evolutionary psychology also sheds light on things like happiness and things like social connections and things like cooperation and love and joy and gratitude. And so I became really interested in trying to develop an area of inquiry that uses evolutionary principles to help shed light on the positives. And I think we've been reasonably successful in getting people to sort of at least pause, you know. And I kind of, at this point in my career, I feel like that's about the best you can do, is push the needle a little bit and get people to at least pause. And I've been very happy with the reception we've gotten regarding the book Positive Evolutionary Psychology. So that's in a nutshell a response to your question, Walter.
Yeah, because I think this problem in accepting evolutionary principles, it goes beyond psychology. It goes to philosophy, history, all humanities, and we have a huge problem for making people accept this view. And why do you think it happens? Is there anything? Uh, is there an evolutionary explanation for that?
Yeah. So is there an evolutionary explanation for the resistance to evolutionary
Yeah.
psychology? If I'm interpreting your question
Yeah.
correctly. It's a great question. And some of my publications over the years have actually looked at that issue. And there's one study I conducted with a student of mine then, Dan Gambacorta, who's now a PhD and a professor at I'm pretty sure it's at Georgia Southern University. We did a study that looked very directly at that question. And it was really interesting what we found. So I'll describe that study and then sort of connect it with the question that you're asking. We did a study to see what is it about evolutionary psychology that seems to rub people the wrong way, and especially academics. What seems to rub academics the wrong way? And I'll tell you, when I first put a proposal to teach evolutionary psychology on the table at my home institution, where I've been for 25 years now, I was surprised at the resistance that I got. It had to go through many levels. The department met, I believe, on at least 3 occasions on very long meetings. It had to go to the next level, the dean's level, the full faculty level, the curriculum committee level, the provost level. And not every step, but at several of those steps, there was this resistance that I really was not expecting. And so I've kind of been very curious about, you know, what gives, this question that you're asking, you know, why is there this resistance? So the study that we designed essentially predicted, and then as you'll see, confirmed this idea that the idea of evolved behavioral sex differences is inherently contentious, that there are people who hear that idea and really, whether it's true or not, whether there's evidence for it or not, there are people who are adamantly against the idea that men and women might have evolved somewhat different behavioral patterns on average over evolutionary time. And our prediction was that people don't hate evolutionary psychology, but that people hate that. That people hate the idea of evolved behavioral sex differences. So we did a study where we had 5 different kinds of questions, and we asked people, how much do you believe that this fact about this fact about behavior is due to biological factors versus environmental factors? We intentionally and knowingly used a very simple way to sort of look at nature versus nurture, even though we know it's more complex. But we were giving these surveys to a broad spectrum of adults. About half of them were academics in a variety of fields, and half of them identified as non-academic, so people in various other careers. And we had 5 kinds of questions. One had items that were adult behavioral sex differences. One example item was women are more sensitive to the cries of infants than men are. Is that more due to nature versus nurture? Then we had questions that were about sex differences, behavioral sex differences in children. So something like girls tend to learn language more easily and earlier than boys do. Is that due to nature versus nurture? Those are both about behavioral sex differences in humans. Next, we said, a lot of evolutionary psychology is not about behavioral sex differences. So we had a third set of items that was about human universals. Um, Fear of heights is something that people experience around the world because it's an adaptation. Um, then, and then we asked people, how much do you think this is due to nature versus nurture? Then we looked at sex differences, but in non-humans. So chickens, we looked at hens versus roosters. One of the questions was something like roosters seem to prefer having a large number of hens, but hens don't seem to have that same preference. Is that due to nature versus nurture? And finally, we looked at, this was us almost poking fun or having fun with the study. We looked at, why do you think dogs are different than cats? Do you think that dogs are more pack oriented because of nature versus nurture, and so forth? And we found 2 very big effects. One was academic status, that academics tended to disagree that adult behavioral sex differences and child behavioral sex differences were due to nature, due to biological influences. So that was a very strong effect. And they had that same belief about differences between boys and girls. However, so there is an effect for academics. However, when we looked at human universals, why are people afraid of heights? Nobody had a problem with that. No, the average amount that people said that was due to nurture versus nature did not differ as a function of academic status. People were fine saying, "Oh yeah, that's biological. Fear of heights, that's definitely biological, and we can understand it evolutionarily." So people didn't seem to have a problem with those kinds of questions. Then this was particularly interesting. Oh, and the same is true of dogs and cats, saying that dogs and cats behaviorally are different because of um, evolutionary biological differences. No one had a problem with that. Being an academic or not didn't influence whether you said that was more nature versus nurture. So those were essentially non-politicized issues. But one of the most interesting things we found had to do with hens versus roosters. So when we asked people, why do you think hens and roosters are different? We found an effect for academic status, that academics literally were more likely than non-academics to say that roosters and hens differ because of different cultural upbringings, which we thought was a little ridiculous because they're just kind of stuck in a chicken coop. Um, and then we divided the academics, and we found that professors in sociology and women's studies were especially likely to say hens and roosters are different because of different environmental and cultural factors, which to me really drove it home. Like, wow, this is the thing that people hate. And people even hate it if you're talking about chickens. Like, there's such a strong resistance to this idea. And I can understand why, like, to sort of see the other side. I think some people say that if you talk about men and women as having evolved behavioral sex differences, some people almost interpret that as like there's a cap to what men are capable of, and there's a cap to what women are capable of. And especially in light of the highly successful women's movement, with so many women going into science and business and succeeding academically, I think people see those trends as incongruous. I don't. Um, I think it's wonderful that women are showing lots of academic success and professional success, and I think that that's a great thing to cultivate. But that doesn't mean that there are zero evolved behavioral sex differences between men and women. So, long story short, what our research has found is that I think a lot of the research that has been about male female behavioral differences, it's a hot button item. It's probably the best known research in evolutionary psychology. And when you put that together, I think it kind of has created unwittingly a firestorm. And I'd say that a lot of the resistance is due to that.
I don't know if Marlon wanna ask something about it.
No, I was about to say that the department to which the academics belong to was a very strong variable, but you mentioned that later on. And I remember that was all the rage in Twitter, I think a couple of years ago, the roosters versus hens experiment that like some profiles I follow use that to mock the gender studies position and so on. But I agree completely with your perspective. I think it's all the more visible, the hostility and so on, because to propose that and to see that empirically, it's seen as a direct attack upon their whole philosophy or the whole
I agree.
philosophy of life, so to speak.
I agree. I think that's very well articulated, Marlon. And I don't I, I don't retract, or I don't regret that we did that research and documented that. I think it really is a very interesting way to say these particular academics are so against behavioral sex differences that they're against it even in a chicken coop. But I could see how, it's almost like there's like a battle. It's almost like there's a battle. There was a very interesting article related to this that came out by the Weingard brothers. They're two brothers, Bo and I forget his brother's name.
Bo and
Brett?
Woe, something like that. Yeah.
Brett?
The brothers Winograd. Yeah.
Yes.
I remember Bo. I think the other is Brett.
I think you might, yeah. And if they're listening, I apologize. I think you guys are both great. But the study that they did was very clever. It was really along these same lines where they content analyzed introductory psychology textbooks, and they looked to see I forget how many they had. I think they had a few dozen, and they looked to see how evolutionary psychology was presented in those textbooks. And they had some way to mark whether the author was someone who came from a more women's studies perspective or a more postmodernist perspective, or a more biologically oriented perspective. And the very short version, what they did was they categorized the presentation in terms of whether the presentation accurately got certain details correct. So they were able to say, was natural selection described accurately? Was the concept of adaptation described accurately? And they had sort of objective criteria for whether the stuff was presented accurately or not. And the very short version they found was that people who were presenting it inaccurately were much more likely to be professors who were identified as women's studies faculty or postmodernist faculty, which is really interesting because it's kind of like they're not really understanding it. What the Weingard study showed was that the people who are most critical of this field also are people who seem to factually understand it least. And I think that's such a problem. And I feel like in my career, I've tried to sort of build conversations and try to come up with a conciliatory way to get people to sort of, listen to each other and sort of learn and have an open mind, as opposed to not understand something and then not even talk about it, and and that kind of thing. So I think there is a lot of resistance, and I think a lot of the things you were saying, Marlon, are very much at the root of it.
Yeah. Um, one of the main fundamental ideas of your entire work is the idea of evolutionary mismatch. And can you explain what evolutionary mismatch is, and why it's important for us
Sure.
to understand the human mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Nicole Wedberg, who's a former student of mine, she was a master's student, great student and great writer. When she and I wrote Positive Evolutionary Psychology, in a bigger sense, we were trying to sort of show that we can look at evolutionary psychology not in terms of sex differences, not in terms of the dark side of the human experience, but that's already been documented in so many ways. But we can also look at it in terms of the bright side of the human experience and how evolution illuminates the bright side of the human experience. And one of the main ways, when you start thinking along these lines, one of the main ideas that we ran into was evolutionary mismatch. So evolutionary mismatch is basically the idea that when you have an organism that is abruptly or quickly taken into an environment that does not match the evolutionary history of that organism, you are likely to run into problems. I teach in the summers. I teach a course on this in China to students in Chongqing, and I found that the simplest way to describe this for people all around the world to understand is the concept of a fish out of water. So when I first taught about mismatch to my students in China, one of my very bright students said to me at the end of the lecture, "We did not understand you." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, okay." And I came back the next day and I thought about it. I said, "Well, what is a simple example?" And then I thought, "Oh, well, I said, raise your hand if you ever had a pet fish." And about half the students had pet fish experiences. And then I said, "Did you ever go into your room when you were a kid and your fish is on the floor or on the carpet?" And a good number of the students had that experience. And, you know, the fish obviously dies. And so the students all understand that. And I say, well, the reason it dies, in one sense, is evolutionary mismatch, because everything about the fish, the evolutionary history of it, the physiology of it, the morphology of it, the behavior of it, is completely designed for a fully aquatic life. And the way that they breathe through their gills and the way that they take oxygen from the water is completely a different respiratory system than animals like us that spend most of their time on land. And so once I said that to students, they're like, "Oh, that made a lot of sense to them." So that fish out of water metaphor can be applied to human behaviors in a lot of ways. So before I get into that, another example that I usually give when I talk about this pertains to zoos. So across my lifetime, zoos across the world changed dramatically. When I was a little boy, I grew up near the Bronx Zoo, which is in the United States considered one of the best zoos. It's very famous. And they used to have something called the Monkey House. And when I was a little boy, I loved the Monkey House. It was about 100-foot corridor, about maybe 30, 40 meters. And there were small cages on either side. And they had different monkeys and different primates, often from different species alongside each other. They were in small spaces. They did not always have conspecifics or members of the same species with them. And at some point in 2012, the Bronx Zoo closed down the famous monkey house. And even worse, they made it administrative offices, which, that's the pits. But the reason they did that was because of evolutionary mismatch. The reason they did that was they had the realization that it's essentially torture, that these are animals whose evolutionary history was living in large open spaces, surrounded by members of their same species, developing extensive social networks that were critical for their entire experience. And when you take them out of that, it's pretty much like putting them in prison when they didn't do anything. Famous research by primate researcher Harry Harlow, who was at University of California for years, showed that when you raise monkeys in isolation, they show everything that looks to humans like anxiety and stress. And they grow up with an inability to form appropriate social interactions. They grow up with an inability to mate appropriately when they reach a certain age, and so forth. And we can think of that as evolutionary mismatch. They do not have adaptations or features that are evolved to match those kinds of conditions in a cage thousands of miles away from where they came from, all alone, essentially, in solitary conditions. So that's applying the idea of evolutionary mismatch to primates in kind of general sense. And then if you step back and think about, well, what about humans? So for humans, evolutionary mismatch is very profound. And one of the very interesting things about it is when you grow up in a certain way with certain norms and certain features of your environment, we don't question them. We don't tend to question the norms and the stimuli and so forth that we see. Um, so when a monkey is born in a small zoo and is just living in a cage, it doesn't have the wherewithal to say, wait a minute, this isn't what I'm evolved to be in. Or when a fish jumps out of a fish tank, it doesn't have the wherewithal to say, wait a minute, I'm an aquatic animal. Well, the same thing's true for humans. So when humans started living in post-agrarian societies after about 10,000 years ago, and up until about 10,000 years ago, all of our ancestors were nomads. Civilization essentially means that this is when people were able to stay put and grow their own food. And once they can grow their own food, they grew larger groups and eventually towns and eventually cities. And group size started to increase dramatically. And that started only about 10,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, 10,000 years is really a blink of an eye. Very few human genome changes have been documented in the last 10,000 years. Lactose tolerance is one of the few. Last I read, there were 3 well documented changes in the human genome in the last 10,000 years. So pretty much we have the same minds and bodies that people had before agriculture, because the biological evolution is much slower than cultural or technological evolution. So from that perspective, gosh, we are so mismatched. Our modern lives are so incredibly mismatched. But just like the fish in the fishbowl, we don't realize it. This is all that we know. Classic example
But may I?
was yes. Go ahead, please.
Sorry for interrupting, because I think the example of the fish out of water is great, but the problem is that when the fish goes out of the bowl, he dies in some minutes. It's different with us.
Yes.
We have a lot of health problems that take years for happen because of our mismatched lives. So I think for this reason, it's so difficult for us to take, because we change our foods and we change everything, and it takes 10, 20 years for something to happen for us. And,
Yes, that's a very good point. I think the fish out of the fishbowl is a very simple example, but for the reasons you allude to, it's perhaps a bit overly simplistic. So many of well, one of the things about evolutionary mismatch is we usually think of it as leading to adverse or negative outcomes. Um, it's I don't know of any situations where we think of evolutionary mismatch leading to positive outcomes. It generally is something that leads to negative outcomes, but people don't realize it. So the foods that you grew up with when you were little, you didn't realize that these were foods that were superfoods that never would have existed before agriculture, that our ancestors, that our digestive systems did not evolve to have in large quantities. In the United States, we have literally, they use the phrase, there's an obesity epidemic, particularly interestingly in relatively impoverished places, which is very ironic that the poorest places in the United States are the places with the most obesity problems. And that's largely because processed food, which is completely evolutionarily unnatural by definition, is cheaper, is easier, and is more accessible than natural food. So we now live in a time and place where it is easier to eat something that was made, designed by someone with a chemistry degree across the country, manufactured in Illinois, 1,000 miles away, put on trucks, moved all the way. It's cheaper to eat that than it is to eat natural vegetables or fruits that just grow outside naturally, which is, I think, absolutely fascinating. So that's and like you're saying, Walter, it's a silent killer. It's a gradual issue. It's a gradual problem. Type 2 diabetes exists in large proportions in the United States. Type 2 B, type 2 diabetes is almost never found in nomadic groups around the world. That's a classic example. Um, so whenever we talk about, quote, civilization, the irony is sometimes civilization is used with a connotation that is somehow people who are superior or have some great thing going on. But as an evolutionist, I would argue that civilization actually comes with a whole bunch of problems, physical, social, emotional problems that are not found in pre-industrialized societies. Food is one of them. Exercise is another one that's very related. Education is another one. Modern public education, which is compulsory or obligatory, requires little kids to be surrounded by a bunch of strangers and sit and listen to one person give them information for hours on end. If you go around the world today and you see how kids learn in nomadic groups anywhere in the world, Peter Gray has done research on this. He's looked at nomadic groups in Australia, he's looked at nomadic groups in South America, in India, in Asia, in Africa. They don't have a word for school. They don't have a word for play. They don't have a word for work. They don't see any of those things as distinct. So when we see kids having problems with school, with education, when we see them maybe have social problems at school because they're surrounded by a whole new group of students every year, or they have attentional problems, and instead of giving them a more natural environment, we just give them a prescription for a drug that's going to chill them out. The evolutionary mismatch idea allows us to step back and sort of think about these kinds of problems in a bigger frame, hopefully in a way that we can better address them for the betterment of people in general.
Marlon, you want to make that question that you...
Yeah, well, Glenn more or less already answered it. I was watching an interview you gave to, I don't recall his name, an English YouTuber, and
Chris Williamson.
Chris Williamson, and you mentioned several human fields, so to speak, regarding mismatches. So my question was about, okay, we know, and the most spoken of the most debated mismatches, that one you mentioned regarding food and diabetes and so on. But what about the psychological mismatches? So you mentioned some. I would add, uh, together with education, child rearing, which in the weird societies is becoming more and more mother focused. So it's not a social process as it used to have
Hmm.
to be across cultures. But my question, as I said, you more or less answered it. It would be about psychological mismatches together with this more physiological or biological
Sure.
mismatches in these fields you mentioned: human emotion, sociability, social relationships, sexuality, aggression, social interaction. But you mentioned some already, so I
Yeah.
don't.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my degree is in social psychology, so that's a particular interest of mine. And one thing that I've published a bit about and that I've become really interested in pertains to the kind of technology that we're using right this second. Obviously, the fact that we're able to have this really fun and interesting conversation across continents is a benefit of Google and cell phone technology and so forth. However, I've come to the conclusion that modern communication technologies may well represent the most dangerous and largest evolutionary mismatch that humans have really experienced. And again, we don't even realize it. It happens before our eyes. So many people that are not educated in evolutionary mismatch, people who do not understand the concept, don't have the intellectual tools to really truly understand what is so problematic with the high prevalence of screen time and modern social media communication. So I'll just give a couple of facts related to that. There was a study where they looked at cyberbullying. So this is where kids, usually kids, adults are not beyond it themselves, but usually kids bully other kids using cell phone technologies, using Instagram, Snapchat, whatever it is. And between the years of about 2011 and 2019. So this was a study where they looked at bullying, cyberbullying across the time when more and more kids were getting cell phones and more kids across the world were getting them at an earlier age. And a very short version is that in as diverse countries as China, Turkey, and the United States and Great Britain, I remember using those just as an example in one article, and Mexico was another one in that example. The percentage of students who said they had been victims of cyberbullying doubled in all those countries. And in that same time period, in that same demographic, the proportion of people, young adults and late teens reporting anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, mood stability disorders also doubled, totally overlapping, completely different study, completely different researchers. It totally overlapped with the rate of cyberbullying increasing. And we all know that totally corresponded to an increase in the use of cell phone technology and social media. And when I talk to my students about this, I'll say, does anyone have a horror story that from, keep the names confidential and so forth, but from social media? And every single student raises their hand. Every student has multiple horror stories that they can tell. So it is a mixed blessing. And the concept of evolutionary mismatch, and I'll put it this way: communication before agriculture, you had one choice: face to face communication, especially before the written word. Before the written word, face to face communication was the only game in town. So humans evolved for face to face communication. We now have communication that often is anonymous. We now have communication where people are often not honest about their identity. We have communication between strangers, which is also would have been very rare under ancestral conditions. And all of these factors, all of these mismatches, nowadays, children who grow up with this modern world often don't even question it. They don't realize it's a problem. They don't realize it's weird. They don't realize that it's not how things are supposed to be because it's the only game in town. So, from my perspective, educating people across industries about evolutionary mismatch and getting people to ask the question, how does this concept relate to the product I'm creating? Ask someone in the food production field, how does evolutionary mismatch inform the work that we are doing? Ask people in public education, how does this inform what we're doing? Ask people in the mental health professions, how does this affect what we're doing? I feel like it is such a powerful concept. And there's, if you're living in the same world I'm living in, there are so many problems and it seems to be increasing and increasing. And I think evolutionary mismatch is not the only root, but I think is largely is at the root at a lot of these or of a lot of these problems.
Is there any other question? When we interview Leda Cosmides, we asked her if she was doing CrossFit, and we'd like to ask you, what are you doing to fight the mismatch? Running marathons, I know.
Yes. Yeah, I just finished my 12th marathon a couple months ago, my first in my 50s. I survived it. I've gotten to know Lita pretty well in my career, by the way. She is absolutely brilliant. What a wonderful thing to have had her on the show. So that's a testament to you guys. I do try to eat only natural food, and I try to exercise as much as I can. Under nomadic conditions, people would have exercised naturally so much more. You don't see obesity, you don't see people out of shape in nomadic groups, and now we have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to join a gym that we don't have time to go to because our lives are so busy. So it's such a change. So I do try to walk the walk as much as I can. I think that love is a huge, important part of our evolutionary history. And I feel very fortunate to have found that in my life. I think family is absolutely critical. And like I was saying earlier, I'm going to visit my dad and my brother. Eating natural foods and exercising in a natural way, trying to have small communities where you see the same individuals over and over. Friendships, I think, are very important. Trying to deal with things like mental health issues, even just like everyday stress and this kind of thing, with natural kinds of remedies to the best of our ability. I mean, obviously modern medicine has been fantastic in so many ways, and there's a lot to be grateful for. But at the same time, stepping back, and when you can solve something naturally, I'd say all things equal, that's probably a better way. So I certainly do my best to walk the walk, and I really appreciate that question. Thank you very much, Walter.
It's funny, Iago was shocked when you read your book and you said that hunter-gatherers, they usually to walk, 20 miles a day. It's about 30 kilometers a day. That's huge. And we don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's no choice. If you're a nomadic group, there's no choice.
Yeah.
So thinking about what was life consistently like for human ancestors before agriculture and doing our best to infuse that into our lives today and to educate people. So this is one of the reasons that we wrote that book and that I teach this content. I truly believe that people across all kinds of industries and fields can use their work and education to make a more positive difference by understanding these concepts.
Well, if we don't have any other question, that's it. Professor Geher, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, for having this conversation, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Iago, Walter, Marlon, everyone, I really appreciate your time, and I think you're doing great stuff, and keep it up, and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.